Welcome to this conversation today with NourbeSe Philip about an unauthorized Italian translation of Zong as told to the author by Setaey Adamu Boateng. I am speaking to you today from the land known as Taranto, and it is a land, and I want to start with this acknowledgement because it is also important to the conversation with NourbeSe today. Toronto is now a city, a multilingual and multicultural city, still very much that has the effect of colonial appropriation and land theft. And yet, below it and with it is the ongoing millennia-old stewardship of peoples that were here long before us. Myself, I arrived in this land only 20 years ago. It has been under the stewardship of the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee people, and particularly the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, that presided over the dish with one spoon belt covenant. It's very important to remind ourselves of the dish with one spoon covenant because the symbolism orients us ethically towards something. It's the teaching of the dish with one spoon covenant is simple and yet incredibly powerful. One dish to be shared among many people with just one spoon. It reminds the people that gather in meetings that are agree to such a treaty to come to meeting, to come to gather together, and when they come, that we share of the same resources, being mindful of others, that we leave food in the plate for others, that we don't take the plate away, and importantly also the dish with one spoon, and that we share also the spoon, we share the tool. Could be language in this particular conversation. But it's important also in that particular, the dish with one spoon covenant, that no knife is at the table, so that we care to speak to one another without harm or without any tools that are there to cause harm. So this is so much for my acknowledgement and what grounds us in this conversation. And what grounds me also is a great one gratitude to NourbeSe for being here and for agreeing to talk to us. I speak as a translator, a practicing translator, a member of the Literary Translation Association of Canada, or the Association de traducteurs et traductrices littéraires canadiennes. And I feel very much implicated in and feel a responsibility to respond to the events that transpired from the unauthorized Italian publication of Zong. LTAC, the Literary Translation Association, stands in solidarity with NourbeSe Philip, her call for the Italian publisher Benway Series to destroy the Italian translation of her book-length poem Zong, as told to the author by Setaey Adamu Boateng, and to apologize officially for their persistence in defending a translation that was initially pursued without the author's knowledge and subsequently published despite the author's explicit and vocal opposition to the translator's stated interpretation of the work. The case draws attention to the deep, systemic, and blithely unacknowledged violence at work in the legal regulation of contracts among publishers in Europe and North America, which perpetrate colonial legacies of careless appropriation of Black and Indigenous cultural expression. It also draws attention to Canada Council's inadequate attention to matters of race when it comes to adjudicating funding for translation projects. And finally, it raises crucial questions regarding the ethics of translation and the obligations the translator has towards a living author. And to start this conversation, I am going to ask NourbeSe to lay out for us a little bit the players, if you want, the actors that have been involved in the current situation. What led you to the petition?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your introduction, Elena. Thank you. My heart is filled with gratitude and appreciation for LTAC and your supporting me in this. I think it's really incumbent on me to make two things before I answer your question. One, we are in November, and November is the anniversary month of the massacre, the Zong massacre. And this year actually is a decade anniversary, 1781 to 2021. It's been 240 years since this happened. So it's a really important month in terms of what is happening. And the second thing I want to say, which goes to the whole idea of translation, you were at a discussion recently in which the name of the ship came up, and the ship was originally called the Zorg, Z-O-R-G, which in the Scandinavian languages and Dutch, I believe, means care. So from the get-go, care that you talked about at the beginning is really important and is woven through this particular incident, care and its absence of care. And also translation, because in the repainting of the ship in West Africa, the R became N. And it became Zong, and as I say sometimes, it sounds like song if you say it quickly enough. And I just want to say that I also echo deeply what you've said about, not bringing knives to the table and so on, which explains to some degree why I have the social media campaign was mainly about revealing to the world how Zong has revealed itself, because I think that's really important. And I think there's some lessons for all of us to learn. I'm still learning lessons. But to get to your question, my initial contract was with Wesleyan University Press. The book was published in 2008, and it had a pretty good home there. I should say though, from the start again, the first sample that they sent to me of the book was a long, narrow book. And I don't know if they had printed all the copies, but I do know when they sent me that first copy of the book, I said to them, no, the text really has to breathe, and this is not going to work. So we're talking now about an actually bound book. I don't know whether it was a sample copy or what, so I sent it back to them, and there was no dispute about it. They redid it, and the book as it exists now is a production, is a material product that I think really does justice to the need for the text to breathe. So that's, yes.
I think I have the Mercury Press.
Yes, so I should say that because wonderful press that published actually all of my early work. I think this was the first one that wasn't published by Mercury. Well, it was published by Mercury here in Canada, but the initial contract was with Wesleyan, and Mercury did a Canadian edition, to which Bev Dario, a shout out to her. So, but that was for a limited run here in Canada. So then Wesleyan, of course, it was a standard contract, and I have to confess that as a former lawyer, I do have some embarrassment that I wasn't more hard-nosed about the contract. But I say this, I am a poet, and I didn't, it was a typical contract. And I probably, not probably looking, there's always, hindsight is always 20/20, as they say. I should have maybe been more hard-nosed about those clauses about translations and so on. I am now, I should say, the last few years, but I was not thinking. I did not anticipate that Zong would become the force that it has become in the world, in the writing and the poetry world. But in 2016, I got an email from the translator, Renata Morrissey, saying that she was very excited. She wanted to translate the book. I said to her, yes, I was interested, but that she would have to get permission from the publishers. I heard nothing more from her until June of 2021, when I got an email from Benway Series saying to me that they were happy to announce that there was the translation was published, and they talked about my coming to Rome and things like that. And I confess here, Rome is my soul city. I love that city, and we don't have time to go into why I love it so much. The ruins are part of it, let me say, time and what it says to me. And my initial response to them was enthusiasm. I was very grateful. I even said the ancestors would be happy. This was before I actually had a chance to sit down and look at what the translation was all about. I was also filled with consternation, because I said, did you get permission for this? Because I was a little disturbed that here was this book, and had they spoken to the publishers? And they wrote back saying, oh, yes, everything is in order, and so on. And I say that because I know there have been allegations made that I'm opposed to this translation because the translator is white. And that is such a calumny against me. I've had other books of mine translated. They've been translated by white authors. And yes, there are discussions to be had as to, who is best able and so on. But that was not at all part of my concern, as my early emails were. Look, I'm so excited. This is wonderful. The oversights and their legality. I'm just looking at your notes here, Elena. So we have Wesleyan, we have Renata, we have Benway Series. Mm-hmm. Once I read and looked at the pages, I became really agitated and disturbed, because it is really important. And on page 203, it mentions that there's an organizing principle to the text once you leave the first section, os. And that is that no word, fragment, or cluster of words can come directly under another. And I was very clear about that. And it took a lot of time, and sometimes I'm floating the words very close to the edge of the word above in the abutting line. But the reason for that is because the text is reparative, it's recuperative. There's a sense in which the text breathes, and we breathe with the text for those people who could not breathe as they were thrown overboard in 1781. Why did I do that? Do that? I don't have an answer for that. As some things I was just going with a gut instinct that this is how the text had to work. There's also the challenge I set myself that I would only use the words that appeared in the mother words, the matrix words. And if I wanted to use a word that wasn't there, then I had to put the word aside. But that inner architecture, I think you heard a colleague, Faisal Dean, talk about a spiritual architecture. I talk about a spiritual technology at work in it that has to be respected for me. Yes. And that was what I shared with them from the get-go. And as I say, it is in the book, it is in Notanda on page 203. I actually set out the rule there. but from the get-go, no one, in June I began writing. I wrote to all the parties concerned, Susanna Taminen, the editor of Wesleyan University Press, Renata, Benway. No one listened to me. Everyone kept telling me, either they ignored it. Wesleyan on one occasion said the texts were exactly the same. And I kept saying, you know, I pulled out just sample random pages and showed them how the text differs and why it was so important. And
yes, yes.
I'm sorry. Yeah, you know, there's so many layers to this. You know, it's the feeling unheard. You know, I speak as someone who comes from a culture that is, I would say, universally despised. I mean, let's get real here. But at the same time, those of us who belong to it understand how so much of what we create and produce in the world is used, is beautiful, is taken up, you know? And I think what it did, it just sort of underscored for me a certain attitude. And it was only when I got to September of this year, I wrote to the Canada Council as well, because in their first email to me, Benway very, you know, almost joyously said they got funding for this to the tune of some $13,000 from the Canada Council. And I could not understand how this had happened, because we know here in Canada, when you're applying for a grant, the hoops you have to jump through to convince a jury. And I know that translators' grants are not juried, but at the same time, you know, this is taxpayers' money. We're all taxpayers here. And I feel that the council has a responsibility to answer and to acknowledge that there are great loopholes in this. Exactly. And I have to say that in my attempts to reach them, there's a lot of opacity on their page right now. I recall a few years ago writing to them on behalf of a fellow writer. I was able to write to the chair of the council and things like that. And I have gone, you know, trawling through, and I cannot find email addresses for the chair, for the board, for the different offices. I think it's a travesty. So to come to your, I think your fourth point here, and being mindful of the time, how did they respond? You know, I kept talking about this deep erasure. And sometimes I wondered whether it had to do with the fact that, you know, was it that they thought that, you know, maybe there wasn't this deep sort of consciousness and intellectual work in the text. I don't know. I don't want to go to those places, but I would wonder sometimes, would they have taken a work by E.E. Cummins and just sort of messed around with the shape of it and then said it was okay?
Yeah.
I can't conceive of that happening.
I should say that I was privileged enough to for you did send me the correspondence, so I had a chance to look at the correspondence carefully, and it was 3 full months of negotiations. And what is very clear from the correspondence is that there seems to be kind of this talking that they're talking to other considerations, and you are insisting on the breath, and the foundational principle. One, before going further, and I realize we haven't made it clear for our audience exactly what Zong is about and how it has become the text it has become. And we were I was in a conversation with you just a few days ago, and we were talking about is it an untranslatable text, or is it? We'll have that conversation in a minute. We should say that Zong is a text that tells a story that cannot be told, and it does so by way of, in fact, taking apart a legal text, taking apart a British legal text that became a kind of crucible for later developments in the abolitionist movement in the 1800s. But in and of itself, it's an obscene legal text because it is about, I don't know how much I should say about it, but it
Can I maybe jump in here and give help you, and we can share it. And I had wondered whether I should start with that, but I thought the preliminary comments that I made were sufficient. But I think it's important at this point. So there is a legal case, Gregson versus Gilbert, that, as Elena is saying, becomes a sort of container and becomes a generator in the abolitionist movement in England. The case is about a slave ship coming across the Atlantic in 1781. The ship gets lost. The captain was inexperienced. It's lost. It takes about 4 months to get from the west coast of Africa to Jamaica, which was its destination. It left with a cargo of 470 enslaved Africans. Some of the slaves, the enslaved people, and the crew became ill on board and died. And then the captain, because the ship is lost, because he says that there wasn't enough water, decides that because of the way, and this is very important in terms of your earlier question about contract law, because of the way contracts, the contract law was at that time, that if he murdered by throwing overboard some of the enslaved people, they would be able to collect insurance monies for the cargo, quote unquote. So he proceeds to throw overboard some between 130 and 150. The number is very slippery depending on what you read. I think the legal case says 150 souls were thrown overboard over a period of 10 days, beginning on November 29th. And it gets into gender and so on, because they threw overboard women and children because they would fetch less money when they got to the destination point in Jamaica. And there is a very disturbing letter by Granville Sharp in which he's talking about the fact, how much would a woman fetch compared to a man and so on. So it's a very difficult case. The case report, Gregson versus Gilbert, is only 2 pages long, some 500 plus different words. Sorry?
It's at the end of the book.
It's at the end of the book, thank you. And so very quickly and succinctly, I set myself the task, locking myself in that text. The first phase was, I'll only use the words as they appear in this 500-page case report, which only mentions murder once. This is all about the destruction of property.
Yes.
And murder is mentioned when one of the justices says, oh, one of the solicitors has said that this may be a case for murder, but we don't think so. This is all about the destruction of property. The second phase of the work, which is where this inner rule becomes relevant, is when I begin to fragment the text and pull words out of each word, and then they begin to arrange. I constructed these dictionaries, and they begin to arrange themselves in the margins of the dictionary. And so what I say, you talk about the breath of, a few minutes ago, the text is where the poetics of the breath, the poetics of the fragment, and the poetics of relations, as in the Glissantian idea, all come together, I think. And that's why it's so crucial for me. And it's such a wound, and it's so bruising. And but I thank you for delving into it, because I think it's important that people know what the mother document. Having studied law, Elena, one of the things I was convinced of was when I saw that document, I knew that all the stories were locked in that two-page document, because the way we study law is you read these cases that are going through the appeal system usually, and all the extraneous, messy stories get squeezed out, extruded until we get to the point of law. Did they have a right to destroy the property?
Mm.
You know, but I knew that all the people there were involved, the crew and the enslaved, because those are all the voices that we're hearing, or all those voices are the voices we're hearing. Yeah.
Yes, and it's what I find extraordinary about the book also, as you mentioned at the beginning, is that over the years, Zong has become, you call it something of a sacred text.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of things I wanted to say about this, also in putting myself in it. I have participated myself to durational readings, durational collective readings of the text, and they are awake. They are and they have a dimension that is incredibly visceral, and the sound aspect, but not just the sound aspect, the way in which the text comes to life as in deep ceremony, and moves towards a different understanding of the legal text itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What is particular and a different, like a way to undo, in fact, the sort of mundane violence that is enacted even in the simple framing of enslaved lives as cargo, and the erasure that it's of carelessness, really, that emerges from that, the violence of the language itself, and hence why you needed to do so much of that. And I found myself that I only really grasped the significance of Zong in those readings, because it does, those moments speak to another, a different episteme, a different way of knowing, a different way of being, and knowing and being at once, that indeed the legal text does not, covers over.
Yes.
And what is ironic about what happened, and sort of me reading through the correspondence, is just how much in the correspondence with Wesleyan University Press, with the people at Benway series, less so the translator, we can talk about later, is the constant appeal against you that the people involved said, oh, we did everything by the letter of the law.
Yes.
We did everything by the letter of the law, and we even had a peer reviewer, and it's as if that guarantees that that is ethically correct.
Yes.
And so the argument made there was, yeah, because we did by the letter of the law, we must be correct.
Yes.
Without a sense, in fact, that the law itself is steeped in coloniality. It is steeped itself within, you called it earlier in your early postings about this, in a transactional logic, right? That it's only about the bottom line at the end of the day. And so I was really quite taken aback, and when I first sort of had a chance to read the correspondence, and to read the logic with which, particularly, and I have to say, I'm very implicated in this, because then I also intervened. The whole sort of things did heat up on Facebook, and I intervened in Italian. And I was one of the few people who could intervene in Italian, like actually speaking in Italian. And I was attacked myself for being for unilaterally sort of agreeing with the author before even seeing the translation. But there's something that eventually I did see the translation. I did see what you sent me, but what to me was quite egregious and that emerged was this very real lack of sensibility and of it's as if suddenly I don't know if I want I feel like calling it white fragility. It comes this sudden putting this wall of we've got the law on our side, that's it, we did everything, and hence and this is a different jurisdiction from yours. The author might have her ideas and so forth, but this is relevant here to Italy and so forth. And that's where another dimension is added as to sort of what the translator's stated interpretation of the is. And I have to say, as a translator myself, I am of sort of the school of any translation is some kind of subjective intervention. You cannot avoid the subjective intervention. And usually translators who acknowledge that would have prefaces, would have their own prefaces. This particular text came without a preface. It comes with a certain idea of transparency to it. But the other thing is that, at least this is again my own practice, when you are dealing with a living author, relation is the first thing that you should stand by. You might have indeed your ideas about, or you might know yourself a little bit more about the culture of arrival or the language, etc. And I don't think that's in dispute. But what I did see throughout the correspondence was a constant not listening to you, or not acknowledging that that something happened without relation, and hence was produced according to a logic that is not what animates the book.
Yes.
And that to me, it's extremely violent, and extremely disrespectful. And I would like for some eventual solution, or like a learning to come out of this, but the boundaries have to be first restored.
Yes.
So that one can go further. So I guess I'm going to ask you, so what was the translator's stated interpretation of the text?
Renata Morrissey felt very, first let me say before I get to that, I think the way you just put that there, something happened according to a logic that is not what the book is about. I couldn't have put it better. It's really quite deeply and profoundly put. It's the impression I have got from her correspondence, and I've said this, I think this is much bigger than I am. It's much bigger than them, I want to say that I have no animus towards her. I really appreciate the fact that every writer wants people to like their books, you know? I mean, that's why we do it, because we want to have an audience. But at the same time, I think people come, you know, we're so locked into what we know, and we don't know what we don't know. And she was very insistent on the fact that there's a migrant crisis in Italy, and that Zong was useful in that respect. Also the legacy of fascism that they, you know, rightly so want to get rid of. But yes, I can understand how this story could be relevant to that, but I don't think the way to do that is to suggest that there's an equivalency between the transatlantic slave trade and all that that has meant in slavery and the migrant crisis, which is a horrific experience that is continuing, that none of us wants to have happen. Yes. But she seemed not to understand that, and that's something that I feel that there's no humility in anything that they talk about, and this text is drenched in humility. It's drenched in the unauthorship of it. I talk about that in Notanda, even to the point where, you know, I think I mentioned this in Notanda as well. I visit Africa to ask permission to bring these voices forward. And on my way back to Europe, to England, I have this thought, well, you must also go to Liverpool. You have to ask those ancestors as well. And that for me was like, I don't know if I can do this, you know, because of this plane that we live on and all these strictures and resentments and so on, however justified. And I did do that. Yes. I went to Liverpool, bought some whiskey, took it down to the harbor, poured the whiskey, and asked those souls from Europe.
Yeah, one thing that emerges from the Notanda very, very clearly, and you repeat it more than once, so it's not just that little technical detail that you mentioned at yes. Page 203. You keep saying, there is the writing that writes itself. Yeah. There is something, and you just mentioned this idea of unauthorship. So the question that seems over and over again to escape the attention of the Italian editors is and the translator is this aspect that
yes,
in fact you're not the author, or you are someone who's actually in obligation to
something else,
the ancestors that are and this aspect indeed sort of went through what I personally think it's a terrible mistranslation, and it does have to do with a cultural ignorance, a deep cultural ignorance, because the moment because I noticed the Italian the publishers and the Rao and in the conversation with me, when this idea of something sacred or the spiritual architecture of a text being foregrounded, and it has to do with obligations towards the ancestors' lives and that reparative intent, this idea of the sacred suddenly for the Italian means, oh, you're being orthodox, there's a more of a kind of monotheistic understanding of, the church like imposing. This is not the case with the text. This is not the sacrality that is happening here. And that was my noticing, like the reaction of the Italians was they heard something completely different.
Yes.
When it comes to the understanding of what is the sacrality at play here. And the other thing that, again, because I did have the chance to read Renata's responses too, yes, that equivalency is suggested, strangely enough, in a way. She mentions at one point in the correspondence that you don't want your text being translated by Google, but a text like this will never be translated by Google. That's not the point. But then what's revelatory was the guiding metaphor that she said she used.
That's right.
In the translation.
The
And which I also saw repeated partially in a review that then has come, because the book is still out there.
Mm-hmm.
And the metaphor is one, I think, that really says something about how we insert ourselves in the narratives as witnesses and bystanders to catastrophe in which we are implicated, in which we're implicated as social, culturally. So she mentions a shipwreck that happened at the just off Lampedusa, and the way she thought about sort of the words on the page, as she took the punto nave. So she took the words of a rescuer from a helicopter.
Yes.
Which tells you a lot about sort of the technology. So where is the perspective being positioned? What it's from above,
looking down,
subjectless.
Yes.
And objectifying.
Yes.
It's objectifying so the words are floating on the page.
Yeah. But
then what you're talking about is the other side of all of this. And it's like, and that doesn't seem to come through to that was that again. I'm still speechless when I when I think of sort of how the power of those metaphors, and how within a narrative of good will and good doing, they actually produce harm.
Producing damage, yes. And what you're saying also, to my mind, is another instance of how what they've done goes against the text. Because one of the things I was very clear about early on was that I wanted to open a space where the reader could be contaminated, because there's a sense in which we're all contaminated, whether we want to be or not, just by virtue of where we live sometimes, and what food comes to us, that, we don't grow our own food any longer, the clothing. And so there's this sense of the opposite of what you're saying, of hovering above, looking down, that, as you say, when you go to the readings, you do become a part of it. And what do we do with that contamination? Sometimes all we can do is be conscious witnesses, but not the looking down. And in her case, I think she had an obligation to, I last night, as I said, I was looking at your questions, and I found this wonderful, I don't know if you know Valérie Loiseau's work, Water Graves. It's a wonderful work, and this is a chapter, it's called The Art of the Unritual in the Greater Caribbean. I'm just going to read one quote here, because she understands, and I had no conversations with her before she wrote this. She sent it to me after it was done, but there's a really striking, going back to your point about the sacrality of the text. Sorry, just bear with me a second here. I marked the pages. This is my yellow tape. Here. This is a chapter called Stone Pillow Bone Water. This pre-linguistic realm is very close to Glissand's sacred original poem made out of grunts, snarls, and roars that introduced at the beginning of Philosophie de la Relation, the frenzy of the original announcing the birth of a prelingual primeval sacred. You know, so, I mean, it's there, you know, if one reads it in a way that allows for that. That there are other places, but I don't want to take too much time reading. But I would direct people who are looking at us here today to go to this work. It's really an amazing work. It's not just Zong, but she's looking at the Greater Caribbean and so on.
We can definitely add
that. Yes, yes.
Add a link. Yeah, continuing on this vein, and possibly also thinking about what is needed to go forward or to build greater awareness, also for the translator community, and also sort of learn from this particular story and its ongoing issue. You have called for the destruction of the translation, and this is something that seemingly has put the Italians really up in arms about it, and there's in a way the Benway series keeps saying, like, this destruction is mindful of the destruction of books, and that reminds you of totalitarian regimes and so forth, and yet books get pulped every day. Books, and it doesn't mean that this can't be a better version, a more ethically responsible version of this work can happen. There is, again, in the correspondence that I was privy to with Renata Mouresi, Mouresi does say at one point that she realized after so much pressing that, oh yes, indeed, we didn't respect the positioning, that the need for the words to breathe on the page, but we couldn't do it because without, she literally says, without compromising the integrity of the page.
Yes.
And and then I said, well, we can do it again, but I can't guarantee that it will be with Benway. So we have different actors that then are, and the editors at Benway, I can't remember the name now.
Mariangela
Guatteri and
Guido
Mazzoli. Mazzoli. And again, I had a little bit of them on Facebook. Mouresi says, I can't guarantee this happened. I pressed to the very end, recognized. And yet then Benway is going at it and defending they literally put up a legal defense memorandum literally on their webpage because at that point, after 3 months, they at any point they could have decided not to go ahead.
Yes.
But they did go ahead, and I understand they justified it by saying that they would not have gotten the Canada Council because they had told Canada Council for bureaucratic reason.
Yeah.
And personal experience, if you have a grant from Canada Council and you're in publishing, there can be, things can be,
yes,
moved. Deadlines are not necessarily absolute deadlines.
Yeah.
and so that was a very, like, that was a turning point there for the Italian. And this what seems to be happening now is that there's such a kind of an attachment to the object book.
Yeah.
With the idea, oh, this will, it's so important to have it. But if these principles are not respected within it, what's the value of that? And again, a destruction is not necessarily, in this particular case, it sounds ominous, but at the end of the day, it isn't. At the end of the day, it's an opportunity, potentially, to then connect differently, to agree that indeed that there's been a mistake.
Yes, yes. I thank you for those comments, and you've touched on, we could talk for, for hours on this, and I'm mindful of our time. I want to say this. I think that my understanding, based on a posting made by Wesleyan University Press on another person's website, I think you know what I'm talking about. Wesleyan has said that they offered to buy all the books from Benway. The fact that Benway refused, I also understand that two people have mentioned this to me, a colleague of mine in Europe who had an exchange with Renata, that apparently she offered to buy the books as well, and they refused. Which shows, to my mind, a sort of malice, a sort of animus in this, that they want to teach me a lesson. I find it ironic that in Italy, you have this migrant crisis, decades long. I remember going to Italy early in the 200s and talking to somebody there about the Mediterranean being another one of these crossings. I know that they're Black writers. One of the wonderful things that's happened, I've been in touch with a couple of Black African-American women who translate Italian into English, and they have contact with Black Italian writers. I suggested, mentor some of these writers, have them begin to write these stories that come out of their lived experience. So to my mind, this is a move straight out of the colonial handbook. We want this, as Benway said, they've done a graphic representation. They haven't even done a proper graphic representation because they have lines coming under each other, which is not what the text looks like. And this, what they don't understand is that the text may look different in Italian. Mm-hmm. But as long as you follow that deep architecture of it, then we have to allow, I'm not locked into how the text looks, but what I'm committed to is that the text must breathe in the way that those people didn't breathe. To come to your point about destroying, I thought about it. I thought, language is very powerful for us. Maybe I should use the word pulp. It's a softer word, the vowels, pulp. But as you and I know, when your books are remaindered, when a publisher comes to the point where your books are not selling, it's remaindered. The books are destroyed unless you can buy them. So that is not, but yes, I know it has a certain kind of resonance when people read it. And there was an intent behind that because, we're still living with the destruction wreaked by the wreckage wreaked by Europe on our cultures, so, and Valerie talks about this, about wreckage and how can you make something out of wreckage, that it's not necessarily, yes, it may be negative at one point, but the rupture allows for a rebirth. But the other thing I want to say in terms of, you say they posted something, I think that they have breached my moral rights as an author because the book advertises on the cover the fact that there's an ancestral connection. In the notanda, it states what the organizational principle is, and that is integral to the work. And legally, I think they have breached it.
Yes.
And so I think we'll have to engage in that dispute at some point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's that, and here again we go into again, there's so many actors in this, and again that accumulation of obeying a logic that is the very one
that the
book is written
the
against.
work is trying to work against.
To work against. I was, and the other slight irony again about this ongoing insistence on defending the object book is that you're up in arms against the author saying you've breached the protocols of care, you've breached my moral rights as an author, and the particular ways in which I understand the sacredness of the text, and yet they're defending the text, the object text, almost as a sacred thing.
As a sacred thing, yes, 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 yes.
The irony is compound.
Yes.
And I just and I would just like for them. I've been attacked myself in my comments, and one comment that was made against me when I pointed out this irony, this repetition, was, oh, in one sentence, you have managed to erase 200 years of juridical progress. I have yet to answer that question, because that says a lot about the faith, the uncritical faith
in the law,
and in that Enlightenment universal idea of the human that indeed is what is at the root of contemporary racism and contemporary ways in which the human continue to produce white supremacy.
Yes.
And this seems to be entirely lost on the part of the publishers. Part of me, I have to say, is a bit relieved to know that Renata Moresi is slightly distancing herself, or has a more, as beginning to have a more nuanced.
Oh, that's good to hear. Yeah.
I mean, this is what I'm hearing from you.
Well, yeah, this is what, as I said, this colleague of mine in England said this to me. I haven't been able to read the stuff in translation, I have to confess, Elena, because it just upsets me so much, and it really sets me back. And I've been so lucky to have help, with the petition and so on, but it really saps my energy. And, also financially, I've had to hire someone to do the social media because I'm not really adept at that and so on. But I also think, I also tell myself every so often, going back to how you started our conversation, I try and remind myself about the good things, that have come out of this. Wesleyan has changed its policy already. It is now going to notify authors when they sell rights. They've set a minimum fee of $500 for the sale of rights for less than 1,000 books. That's a good thing. That's going to redound to all authors, and I hope that then has a sort of resonating effect in the industry as a whole. So already there have been some changes, although many a time, being raised Christian, I would think, dear Lord, take this cup from me, it's too much. Christ in his passion, it's too much. Please take it from me. But so I'm really happy about that. But I do think, I find it ironic that they look to North America, they take a North American author's work, North American Caribbean author's work, and then when the author, says, oh, but this is not right, they then sort of turn it around and say, oh, but you can't import North American practices into Italy. Do you know, there is something, one of the things, I think you've heard me say this, is that we live in forensic landscapes, very much so in North America. The two founding crimes, theft of a land and theft of a people. And somehow we have, you know, I think we're gaining an understanding of that. And how do we maneuver within that? And I pulled out this poem when you were talking from Zong, Zong number 11. It's very short. Suppose the law is not, does not, would not, be not. Suppose the law not a crime. Suppose the law a loss. Suppose the law. Suppose. Nombre, Falope, Bisuga, Nuru, Chimwala, Sala. Suppose the law not a crime. Suppose. Yeah, I think that really encapsulates this thing that you're grappling with in terms of Italy, do you know? Mm-hmm. At the same time, we can't live without law, do you know? Mm-hmm. Like we need it to organize. A community implies law, you know, we can't, but how do we make it something that is not from the helicopter view and more
exactly
from the ground up?
And again, it's part of the architecture of modernity and the law, of Western modernity, that does not center relation. It centers this the subject-less, all-seeing, the panopticon, if you
want. The panopticon, exactly.
At the expense of just so many forms, like Earth itself.
Yes, yes, Earth itself.
All of its hierarchies then ends up producing disposability. Everything is disposable.
Absolutely.
And producing that. I wanted to, in closing, because I know we've taken so much time, I wanted to, and thank you so much for that, the reading, sort of getting that poem really encapsulates so much and speaks to so much, and to sit with that. Your petition has now garnered more than 1,000 signatures. We do hope that this particular conversation, we haven't talked about it too much, but we didn't talk about the role that Canada Council had in this. I'll just briefly mention that as, you know, a bureaucratic institution, then again, Canada Council, the translation abroad program is such that, again, does not contemplate the involvement of the author. Publishers apply to it directly as long as the author is Canadian. And yet, under the direction of Jesse Wente, the Canada Council has begun to incorporate decolonial language, has begun to incorporate, and there's also the statement that is mentioned in the petition itself, that it needs to pay attention to strive to racial justice, for racial justice. we do hope that there might be an officer out there that is listening
to this.
that can sort of address the oversights that in the legal language allow for something like this to happen, and for an author to an author living by a poetics of unauthoring and living by obligations to a decolonial poetics, because that is also breath. So we're hoping that this conversation will enable people on the Canada Council that at the moment they're not beholden. In the Translation Abroad program, publishers simply produce a statement of their intentions and what they intend to do, and it's only because on the grounds of the of national identity of the Canadianness of the author, that then, and no questions are asked around whether the publisher is in touch with the author or anything. So again, a legal language that does not foreground relation.
Yes.
That's also a problem.
Yeah.
And we hope that this conversation will
move
some of the conversation forward. And finally, I wanted to quote someone from the petition site. The comments have been wonderful and very insightful on the petition. And what I think this petition reminds us is that we need to strive, all of us, for greater awareness, humility, and accountability in what is the delicate. Translation is a relational craft.
It is.
It's a delicate one. There's a delicate balance. There are always subjects involved. The great illusion of a particular kind of colonial idea of translation is that it is about transparency and equivalency. This is never, ever the case. And L.A. Moss, who is a signatory of the petition, they write, "The situation is a clarion call to translators and publishers to do better and to consider their ethical responsibility in the public care of works, not only of art, but of body, of heart, of history, of healing." I did get permission to quote.
Good.
So thank you, NourbeSe, for agreeing to have this conversation with me today and with us at the Literary Translators Association. And I do hope that something good may come from this.
I hope so too, and I feel already it has. Just meeting these young women and finding out more about what they're doing. I'm so grateful to all of you who've sort of had me here today to talk about it, because sometimes I've wondered, like, why don't you just walk away and we have a saying in the Caribbean, go and plant peas in Tobago. Plant poetic peas. Oh, it is, hence the view in the background. But joking aside, no, it has been a heavy, heavy burden for me, and one that really emphasizes still how devalued, because I wanted to ask you, but we don't have the time another time. As an Italian, when you talked about the translators and the publishers being so offended by the introduction of sacrality, is it because of the role of the Catholic Church and so on? Because, we as African people, we're not seen as having to be fully human I see, and indigenous people, all of us who are marginalized, it's the breath, it's our spirituality, which has been devalued, which we have been made afraid of, which we have thought of as being, part of the devil and so on. And so I'm not advocating for anyone to take up this practice, but we are the results of so many, and these things live in us. And I feel very strongly that part of being human is acknowledging what our spirituality is. And part of it is, and I think all peoples, caring for ancestors, caring for the dead. Again, this work talks about, women's work is usually about lamentation. Zong is a lamentation about something that affected the entire world and contaminated us all. And so I just hope that they have a greater understanding that is not personal, but I do wish that they would have heard me, listened to me. I wish this Wesleyan as well, because had they come on board earlier, I think we could have maybe, moved this in a different direction. It's only when I threatened to go public that Wesleyan eventually said, oh, yes, I see what you mean. The texts are not, the versions are not are very different. So I thank you all again. And I just hope that we can all learn from this.
Yes. In the meantime, I do invite people to sign on the petition, because I do think it's important, again, for the sake of, in Italian you say mettere I paletti, which is to at least set a boundary, set the need to say, well, a wrong has been done.
Yes.
Otherwise, it can, it's like the story of reconciliation in Canada. They jump to reconciliation
without acknowledging.
So the first moment is to acknowledge that the wrong is there, and that it has to and that it has been covered over. This is, on some level, it is the beginning of a greater set of conversations that I hope the Literary Translators Association will start having. When I was talking to Bilal Hashmi about the president, about this event, you're not alone, NourbeSe, with these issues. And I think it's something that that lends itself to further conversations and further ways where we can continue to learn and continue to engage, indeed, with our mistake, and
yes.
Make the call outs become call-ins, and then
yes.
So thank you again so much.
Thank you.
And I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you. This has been it's really wonderful to sit and, to share some of my questions and feelings and so on and thoughts with a wonderful thinker like you. And thank you to LTAC for hosting me.
And please don't forget to sign the petition.
Please sign the petition, everyone. I'm still sending it out to friends and so on. So I do it in waves, late night.
And there is an Italian translation of the petition. So
wonderful. Yes. I mean, without you, I don't know what I would have done, because you have been the bridge to, and one of the things that I say, we all make mistakes.
I still have to finish being the bridge, because I don't think I have done quite enough yet.
Well, you have a lot on your plate. And so whatever little you've done, I'm immensely grateful for. Yes, please.